Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content. Right now, as of right now, all of the round 2 series have concluded thus far, and that's what we're pretty much going to talk about for this entire episode. We're also going to preview the round 3 and the conference finals matchups in this episode as well. And also, shout out to you guys for showing love on the TikToks and showing love to the YouTube Shorts. We got our most viewed YouTube short, thanks to you guys. So please don't forget to like and subscribe, and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OPT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yeah, so we've had, as you said, the second round is over. So we've got some eliminations to talk about, right?
Mm-hmm.
As well as teams that are moving on. So we already talked about one in our previous episode, right? We already talked about Cavs Boston. Also had a live stream for that as well. So we're moving on to the next one, right? Which was Dallas OKC, right? This was one where we picked OKC. We thought they were going to win in 7. They ended up losing in 6 to the Mavs. And the Mavs, big part of it was the defense, right? So obviously, defensively, they were able to kind of take away the paint, make it really tough for OKC to score, right? Kind of forcing either guys to take tough contested shots around the rim, or since they couldn't always even get to the rim, they had to kind of rely on their three-point shooting. And three-point shooting kind of comes and goes in the playoffs, right? Where, some games it's there, some games it's not, right? So for Dallas, right, you got a little bit more offensively that you could work with, right? Because obviously you have Luka, and a healthy Luka, right, is one of the best players in the NBA, right? No surprise there. But you also have Kyrie Irving, right, who has been a really good co-star, really good soldier this year, on both ends of the floor, right, where he's kind of bought in and he's done a lot of things that you would want, right, a former champion and former number 1 pick who's also an all-star caliber guy to do. The new additions, right? Guys like Daniel Gafford, PJ Washington, Derek Jones Jr. showed up big in this series, right? Derek Lively off the bench. I mean, that's kind of really a big part of it is the role players for Dallas stepped up. Honestly, more so than most of OKC's stars other than SGA, right? So, and that kind of allowed for, you had a couple of games where Luka and Kyrie weren't as great. But a guy like a PJ Washington ends up having 20 plus points in a game, multiple threes, right? Derek Jones Jr. right in this type of game, right at 22 points in Game 6, 4 of 6 from 3, including the Dacker shot, right, where it's like this tough, ridiculous turnaround contested shot where it's like you can live with that if it's Luka or Kyrie, but Derek Jones Jr. that's kind of a like a demoralizing type of play, right, where OKC, right, you're kind of forcing the other guys to beat you, and they did beat you, right? Obviously a lot of that, again, you give credit to the role players on Dallas for stepping up in a way that you weren't necessarily sure if they were, right? PJ Washington had never been in the playoffs before, right? This is his first time in the postseason, and he's been great for Dallas, right? He's kind of changed their lives in a way, right? Where, you look at what he was doing in Charlotte, and it's like, yeah, he was good, but he's fit right in like a glove for Dallas, right? Where he's a guy that can kind of do a lot of different things on both ends of the floor. His 3-point shooting would, which had been kind of spotty, right, has really picked up. Where now all of a sudden, in this series, right, he can't miss, right? Because in the first round, he didn't really shoot that great from 3, but it didn't really matter for the most part, right? Because you got, really good performances from other guys, right? Like Kyrie was very good throughout the Clippers series, right? Luka had his moments, right? But in this series, you needed more, right? Because you were playing a better team in OKC, right? Obviously the Clippers were without Kawhi, but this time around, again, you needed more from your role players, and you got it from all those guys, and it really, kind of highlights how Dallas, kind of, I don't want to say saved their season, but in a way they did with the moves they made at the deadline, bringing in PJ Washington and Daniel Gafford, and those guys initially were coming off the bench. Now they're starting, and they're playing big minutes and making a lot of big plays for this team. And it's just kind of cool to see, right? Because this was a team that was really disappointing last year, right? Where they make the Kyrie trade, and initially a lot of people weren't super high on it. We liked the the pairing of those two guys, we just didn't necessarily believe that they had enough around them to build out a high level defense, and they didn't. They were bad last year, and they weren't really that great together. But this season, that's all been flipped, and all of a sudden now it looks like a really good pairing. And now you have the role players around you to make it work. Like in this series, PJ Washington shot 47% from three, on 49 3-point attempts. So basically, you're saying that one of your role players who didn't shoot well in the last series shot, almost 50% from three, right? So I mean, that's kind of something where that swings a series, right? Because if PJ Washington shot like how he did in the first round, then this is probably a 7-game series, or maybe even goes OKC's way. I mean, obviously that's kind of a simplification of things because there's a lot that Dallas did right anyways, but it just highlights the great moves that they made. And that's kind of what you want if you're a team, right? Where it's like, ideally to win a championship, you kind of have to be good all year. But, one thing that you can do is you can kind of make a deep run if you peak at the right time. And for a team like Dallas, right, they were one of the only teams at the deadline that really made a move in the Western Conference, right? Like, you look around, Denver didn't really make any moves at the deadline. I don't think they made one trade at all, right? Minnesota, I guess, traded for Monte Morris, but he hasn't really been much of a factor in these playoffs, right? OKC traded for Gordon Hayward. He did absolutely nothing in this series, or really most of his time there, anyways. Right? Not even in the regular season. And then after that, right? You just no one else really did much, but Dallas did. So it kind of validates the moves that they made at the deadline. Where you gave up picks. So this team is kind of what you have at least right now. We'll see. If you have flexibility moving forward, but it got you to a conference finals. And for Luca, right, this is a kind of a huge bounce back reclamation of a season because, last year you kind of had some people that were kind of looking at him differently because of the fact that, they were bad for a good chunk of the year. Then they missed the playoffs and it just looked like guys kind of gave up towards the end. And then also like, they tanked to get that draft pick. They took Derek Lively, which was huge for them, right? Like OKC could have had him, but, they didn't do that. And he hurt them in this series. So, for Dallas, you give them a lot of praise. But for OKC, you still tip your cap because they played well in the postseason, but they also clearly just weren't quite ready, to take the huge jump, which you just don't normally see from young teams, right? Like generally, you don't see this type of a jump anyways, where it's like you're not a playoff team, and then the next year you're the 1 seed in the West. Um, and at the end of the day, Dallas's size and physicality kind of wore out OKC by the end of the series. In addition to OKC's guys also just kind of not quite being ready for the moment. But in the end, Dallas showed that they were the better team. So that's where you give a lot of credit, even to a guy like a Jason Kidd, where a lot of people had questions about him. But he's kind of improved a lot as a coach as well. And it certainly helps, obviously, to have Luca and Kyrie, but he's also done some good things as well. And you can see some of the inexperience for OKC kind of, being a problem. But either way, Dallas was the better team. We were wrong about them, but we did have them as a dark horse going into the playoffs. But I thought OKC was better, but they weren't. Dallas showed that they were better. And now they're going to the conference finals to face, Minnesota, who we'll get to, eventually.
Yeah, and it's kind of tough, thinking about it from Oklahoma City's perspective. I think you have a lot to be happy about in terms of your future and stuff like that. But this experience is needed. These guys need this. They're young, and they're gonna have plenty more playoff battles ahead of them. Considering they keep this core together, because why not? It's just a matter of you got to win while the roster is kind of on the cheaper end of things. Because if you don't win in the next probably 3 years, you're looking at a rough, salary and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, you don't have any free agents that you need to worry about, retaining or anything like that. Really, your objective should be to move on from Gordon Hayward. Obviously, they're going to renounce his rights. And then also, you got to make a decision on Giddey as well. Do you want to keep him? Is he a long-term piece? Or are you kind of getting rid of him? Because, with Hayward kind of off your team, you'll have $30 million to spend, and it'll be more if you do move off of Giddey as well. So that gives you a lot of leeway and freedom to kind of do what you want to do. Okay. I don't know what that was. Sorry. But yeah, the biggest offseason need for them, for sure, I think it's going to be, it's kind of wild to say, but an even more consistent 3-point shooter. I think that's going to help them because, like you said, it's tough when, you're jacking a lot of threes and it doesn't really translate. But if you have a guy who kind of is known for that knockdown shooting and is like a consistent 40% shooter, that could help you a lot, especially off the ball. I think that's kind of where they struggle. But at the end of the day, experience is also needed as well. But, I'm looking at Dallas and, you feel amazing about them. Just considering where they were last year, it's honestly like a fever dream. And I think, the unsung heroes of this series, for sure, obviously, the main guys in Kyrie, Luca, PJ Washington, even, but like Daniel Gafford and, Derek Lively, those guys were amazing. Like with Lively, plus 26 in an elimination game as a rookie is insane. That guy
Yeah.
is special, I think. He provides a lot, and I think he's going to be a very big key going into the Minnesota matchup.
Yeah. I mean, again, like you said, it's going to be an interesting offseason for Oklahoma City, mainly because of the fact that, like you said, you have the cap space. In addition to now, you kind of have to start deciding which guys are you going to kind of keep around. Like you still have guys that are. It's going to be a while before you have to pay them, right? Like you don't have to pay Chet or Jalen Williams until a season or two from now. But Giddy's going into year 4. And does he get the extension? Probably not. Maybe not from OKC. So I guess you kind of wonder, like, do you kind of tough it out and kind of see, maybe if year 4 gets better for him, or is he kind of on the way out? I mean, given the fact that he wasn't playing as many minutes, still can't really shoot, and the confidence seems like it took a step back. It feels like he probably isn't going to be on this team next year. Maybe he is, but I think if you swap him out with another guard that's probably just kind of like you said, a better off ball type guy, right? Then that's probably better because Shea's going to have the ball in his hand. So it's like it doesn't really fit with him and Giddy, especially if Giddy can't shoot. If he could shoot, then it could probably work. But without the 3-point shot, it just isn't. But you also need size too, because I think you can't necessarily come out of this series if you're OKC and think we're good in terms of the front court depth. Like you needed more, right? Like and again, like the Bismack Biyombo signing, like not that that was going to swing a series in any way, but just not having another like 7 foot ish type guy, just some other big that you could put out there to help get you some rebounds. Like it just hurts, right? Because that's one of the ways that you lost, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
Dallas was able to generate some easy offense around the rim, even when they were missing, because they could get offensive rebounds, they could get lobs, and there was nothing OKC could really do about it, especially if Chet got into foul trouble.
Yeah.
So,
And it showed its
that's
head in the game 6. Like, I think they out
yeah,
rebounded OKC by 47-31 margin. So, and like you
exactly. And
talked
that's
about, second chance points, key to victory.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a lot of times, series are won on, especially in 6, 7 game series, they're won on margin. So, something like rebounding, that's a huge factor where it's like, you can't get out rebounded like that. If you're Dallas, or excuse me, if you're OKC, right? Because
Yeah.
especially on the offensive glass, right? Because it's one thing, if you're kind of even on, in terms of defensive rebounds, but offensive rebounds, especially again, second chance opportunities that create either open threes, or they generate putbacks, at the rim or fouls or whatever.
Yeah.
Because even if it's not a shot, right? Like somebody might foul to kind of prevent the offensive rebound, and then you're in a rough spot. So that's where OKC is going to have to upgrade.
Yeah.
But again, like you don't look at it as a failure of a season. You look at it as a learning experience, right? You got a lot of playoff experience against some, a good team in the Mavs that has a superstar. Now you just kind of go into the offseason, see where you go from there. You got the 12th pick in the draft, so you either draft somebody, either a big or some type of, solid role player that can shoot, or you move it for a veteran guy. I don't know if they're going to do that, but again, you have some options, but you just have to be careful, right? Because at a certain point, you may end up waiting too long, and like you said, it gets to a point where you pay everybody and you can't keep everybody. Then you're going to have to get rid of somebody and not get a lot in return. So I think, again, I think this offseason, if you're OKC, you need to be a little bit more, I don't know, just a little bit more precise in terms of what you want to do. I think you
Hmm.
have to kind of decide, do we kind of go all in and bring in somebody, or do we, kind of just wait it out another year? I think you have to kind of decide and be more aggressive this offseason because I think, again, not really doing anything at the trade deadline except for bringing in Gordon Hayward, who did nothing. You know, that's probably the difference between losing in the second round versus being in the conference finals, possibly with a trip to the NBA finals, right? That right there is probably a the difference. In addition to Dallas just being better, but again, part of that, like I said, is not having another guy that you could bring in with size. So I think if you're OKC, that's what you need to target in the offseason. And you need to do that because I think if you don't, that's, again, like other teams may pass you by. Like OKC is still going to be one of the better teams. I'm just saying that, like, you just never know. In the NBA, things can kind of move really quickly, faster than we think, right? Where, all of a sudden you maybe 2 seasons from now, a team like the Spurs, ends up, being in the playoffs and is kind of all of a sudden the hot new team, or the Houston Rockets, bring in somebody. So that's where I'm saying if you're OKC, you need to be aggressive going into the offseason. And again, I don't know if they're going to be able to trade for a star. I don't know if they're going to draft somebody. Who knows? But you got to do something, I think. Um, but either way, this was a really good season, and I think you got to get your battle stars. This is usually why young teams tend to not, go super far in the postseason because you kind of have to go through certain battles. And I think you saw SGA clearly he was more than he showed everybody, which we already knew, right? But obviously he's more than capable of being a superstar in the playoffs. It's just now about finding everybody else fitting around him, which you already have some good fits. You just need more. And obviously some of that's going to come with the young guys like Jalen and Chet getting more experience and just getting better as players. And then some of that also is, figuring out some of the other supporting cast, which you're going to have to decide. But you have some decent players in terms of supporting cast, like, an Isaiah Joe is a decent 3-point shooter, or, an Aaron Wiggins or other guys like that. You just kind of have to add more, right? So maybe one of the guys that is on the team now that they've drafted, maybe they get better, like a Usman Jang, or somebody like that, but you probably just also just need to bring in somebody. So
Yeah, some exterior help would definitely, I think, put them over the edge and kind of push them into that tier that we know that they can be and will be at some point. It's just a matter of kind of when. And then also, like from Dallas's perspective, I think this solidifies and validates the Kyrie Irving trade 100%. I know a lot of people were really, really low on it last year after they
yeah,
didn't make the playoffs, but now you see that this duo is elite. They can work together. They definitely know how to work off the ball as well, which is beautiful. And then having the two big men alongside them, it comes with some amazing pick and roll sets, are arguably, some of the best in the league. But, now they get to move on. And I think that's the biggest victory for the Mavericks where, you're
yeah,
back. Like they are so back. It's like, we're reliving, the first time that they went to the conference finals where you feel
yeah,
very, very good about this team. And, it's not, the Mavericks of old where it's just Luka and he's running the show and he's kind of carrying the load. It's a team effort. And I think that
yeah.
is huge. That's a huge deal. It's a game changer.
I think that's a big win for Dallas is that, because the fact that you were able to win games where Luca didn't have to score like 40 plus points,
Hmm.
and also like the fact that now you can win these grinded out games where you don't have to win a game only if it's like 125, to, 115 or something like that. Now you can
Yeah.
win some of these lower scoring games, right? Like that's kind of a, that's huge, right? Where now their defense is kind of able to set the tone and now your superstars can kind of carry the offense, and then the other guys feed off that. Because a guy like Luca or Kyrie, right, they can get guys good looks, right? Those guys are really good passer playmakers, especially Luca, right, where he's got some of the LeBron type abilities, where he's kind of at these weird angles, he's in midair, and he's able to kind of see. The open guys. Like we saw that in game 6, right? Where he made, the big plays, some of the big plays at the end wasn't because of him scoring. It was about him using his threat as a scorer to find guys, right? Like finding, like a Derek Jones Jr. or a PJ Washington, for that last possession, right? Where he gets fouled on the three and gets 3 free throws, to close out the game.
Which is
So,
ironic
yeah,
considering, the free throw merchant, as a lot of NBA fans have labeled him, fouls a guy on threes, and OKC loses their series because of free throws.
right. But I'm just saying, like, that's just kind of a, a
It's
key thing
elite.
is yeah, it's helpful to have a guy like that, and that's what makes a guy like that so tough to guard because
Hmm.
he can beat you obviously by scoring, 30, 10, and 10. Um, but again, the 10 plus assists are kind of huge, right? It's kind of like, what Harden used to do back in the day, but I think Luca's ceiling is a little bit hot. Well, not a little bit, is higher than Harden's just because I think you can kind of trust him more in big games than, a Harden, even though Harden was really good. And he had some teams where, again, they were good, maybe a little bit of bad luck, right? Like Chris Paul getting hurt, which might flip some things. But you know, that's the thing is that, like you said, now it's not like a super heliocentric team where it's like Luca has the ball literally all the time and just basically has to do literally everything. Now you have another guy in Kyrie, a co-star, right, which can also help get it done and kind of get his own as well, right? Because
Yes, sir.
there have been spots in the playoffs and in the regular season where it's like, okay, this is Kyrie's quarter, or this is a Kyrie stretch where it's like, obviously Luca, can do what he wants, but Kyrie can have the ball and he can all of a sudden score, quick, in quick spurts, or find other guys, like the bigs for the lob. So, like you said, it validates the Kyrie Irving trade completely because now you're in the conference finals where there's no way they would have made the conference finals without Kyrie. And of course, the moves they made at the deadline as well. That combination helps. But we talked about it where it's like, part of the big thing is that now you have better role players around Luca and Kyrie, especially on the defensive end. You have more two-way guys now, right? It's not just a bunch of, either mainly offensive guys or just limited players who just aren't that great. Like Dwight Powell, I guess, can defend at times, but he's just not that great, right? He's not like a guy that you want as a starter. Ideally either he's, a backup or just doesn't play at all, like we've
Sure.
already seen.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. That center
or even
rotation they have is so elite.
exactly, yeah, and it's like, a guy like a Maxi Kleba, would have helped, because he's a stretch, but like you have PJ Washington who can kind of fill in and kind of, play a similar role, right? He can shoot and he can also do some stuff. So that's kind of the cool thing about Dallas is now they have more ways to hurt you other than just we have Luca who's going to score 40 every game,
Right.
and beat us that, and we're going to beat you that way. Now they have, Kyrie who can do stuff, or obviously on the defensive end you have Gafford or Lively, or like you said, Washington. So there's so many more options now for Dallas where this is a really quality team. Um, and again, it's the second time for Luca where you're in the conference finals, right? Obviously, last year they missed the playoffs. And like you said, it validates the Kyrie trade, but it also makes Luca look a lot better because again, like I had kind of said, I think there were some people that were starting to sour on him
Hmm.
the way the last season went. I mean, I feel like now you can just say you just flushed last year down the toilet, just because the team had changed so much, right? Like you lost Jalen Brunson and couldn't really replace him with anybody.
Right.
And then at the deadline, you're able to kind of buy low on a guy in Kyrie who's clearly very talented, but his stock had dropped significantly. And this is kind of why you always bet on talent because you kind of just hope that the guy kind of figures it out, and if he figures it out, he's a special player.
Yeah.
So
And a
that's
guy
kind
like
of the
Luca, he makes everybody around him significantly better, or at least he's supposed to. That's been his track record, and I think that's what people kind of expected with Kyrie Irving. It's just they kind of like were too premature on judging it, and that's kind of the danger of it because now you give them a full season, you give them time to retool the roster, and this is what you get. They're back.
exactly. Again, congratulations to Dallas on, again, another season. Because again, this is another year where you had a team, that upgraded at the deadline and the upgrades paid off because, Lakers last year made moves at the deadline, got to the conference finals. Difference is now you have guys that I think are a little bit more playable, right? Where like, Washington and Gafford, you haven't seen them get played off the floor in a way that like as we got deeper into the playoffs last year, like Malik Beasley got played off the floor, or like Jared Vanderbilt got played off the floor, or
Hmm.
even D'Angelo Russell got played off the floor. But
Yeah.
now with Dallas, those guys, because they're closer to being two-way guys, right? Like, Vanderbilt can defend but doesn't do as much on offense, right? And Beasley can shoot, but if he's not shooting, it's not going to help you as much, right? D'Lo kind of a similar guy. These guys are two-way guys, right? Now, again, for Jones, if his three-point shot isn't falling, it's going to look a lot different. But obviously, because Luca can kind of find the angles to throw the lobs, or get dump offs in the paint, and just because that guy plays super hard as
Right.
well, right? Like he's going to find ways to impact the game on both ends of the floor. Like he was guarding Paul George in the first round, and then in this series, right, he was kind of tag teaming guarding SGA at different points. And then again, just being able to crash the offensive glass, contesting shots, blocking shots, which is kind of huge. It's just Dallas's athleticism is kind of the big, kind of eye popping factor now because this was not a very athletic team the last few seasons. But now you got athletes everywhere on the floor, right? Because
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of a huge factor as well. And just athletes, guys that run the floor, guys that are going to do the dirty work alongside Luca and Kyrie, who are more so skill guys. And then even a guy like a Kyrie, will dig in defensively. Even Luca sometimes will dig in defensively, or at the very least help out on the boards.
Yeah.
So
You've seen it's kind of been like a trickle down effect in a positive way where the identity of the team for sure has taken a new shape. And like you were talking about with the athleticism, I think it's so cool that like, you know, when there's a pick and roll between, I don't know, let's take Luca, Gafford or Lively, interchangeable, I think at this point, or Derek Jones Jr. Like they have sets where both of those guys are crashing while Luca is driving. One of those guys is getting a lob. That's the amazing thing. And it could also be like more of a slip thing. Like one of the guys slips and then Jones cuts baseline, and that's easy 2 points because of the IQ and the ability of all three of those guys on the court. It's just amazing, I think.
yeah. Um, but now we got to move on. So I guess we'll hit Pacers Knicks before we hit Minnesota Denver. Um, so obviously Pacers Knicks, right? Pacers end up winning in Game 7. It's another one where we didn't get it right. This was a blowout, right? The Pacers ended up winning 130, 109. And it wasn't really close, right? Like it was pretty much. It felt like it was kind of over pretty quickly, right? Indiana's the shots were falling early. And it kept going and going and going. Um, the Knicks cut into it eventually, but you just knew they didn't have enough. And then obviously Brunson fractures his hand, and that was kind of I mean, the game was already over, but that was obviously like the dagger, and that was kind of that kind of sums up the Knicks season for the most part. Is that just you know a lot of just rough moments in regards to the injuries, right? Like just bad luck, where it's like you won a lot of games, you had a really good roster, you made big moves, you got OG Anunoby, right? You brought in Bogdanovich and Alec Burks, and then a bunch of those guys aren't available, right? Randall goes down during the regular season, and then in the playoffs, right? Bojan Bogdanovic goes down, right? Mitchell Robinson goes down. OG Anunoby goes down. Even Josh Hart was kind of playing on one leg, basically. I guess he had the abdominal strain, but and at the end of the day, there's a certain level where there's too many guys that can't really help you, where it's just too much, right? Like OG Anunoby tried to play, but just couldn't move on defense. He hit his first two shots, but you could tell defensively he wasn't moving right. And this was a game where you needed to play defense in order to kind of win the game, because the Knicks didn't really have too many issues offensively. They put up 109, and there was a stretch where they got it close. But giving up 130 is brutal, and they
Yeah.
just couldn't move and match what Indiana was doing. And also Indiana was hitting everything. It wasn't a game where they were hitting ridiculous shots. They created a lot of high quality looks, but shooting 76% from the field just doesn't happen. And they ended the game shooting the best percentage in a playoff game ever, right? I mean,
Right.
they shot 67% from the field. I think the second one before this was Knicks Celtics game 2 in 1990, and the Celtics shot like 64% or whatever from the field. But that was a game 2 over 30 years ago. But this is a game 7, right?
Right.
Usually game 7s are, a lot uglier than this, right? Like not all of them are close. Like I think, I remember a stat from somebody. I think it was Matt Moore of Locked On Nuggets. But was saying that like the average margin of victory or the average losing margin in game 7 is like 10 points. But this was what, like a 20-point loss basically. So, I mean, at the end of the day, the Knicks didn't have enough, and the Pacers, they won the war of attrition. You still give them credit for winning the series, because most people picked the Knicks to win this series. I think the pivot point was Game 3 because the Knicks were up 2-0. They had a chance to win Game 3, and then Andrew Nemhart hits the shot, and kind of that's the dagger, and that was kind of the swing point. Because if the Knicks go up 3-0, they probably find a way to win this series, because you just have to win 1 out of 4. Um, but obviously, OG being out for most of the series after game 2 definitely hurts. Josh Hart on one leg, but of course, that's kind of what happens, right? Once you're down to a handful of guys, and you just don't have much left in the tank. You still give a lot of credit to the Knicks for trying. They never made injuries an excuse for why they were losing, which was nice, because a lot of times you'll hear that from teams or players. But you didn't have enough, right? Brunson mentioned he didn't think it was a successful season. I guess you can view that in that lens, but I think at least for the Knicks, you learn some things. Like you learned that Brunson obviously can be for sure a franchise guy where if he's on your team, you're good enough, at least in the East, to be a real contender, right? Because I think they would have won this series if they had most of their guys, and they'd be one of the final four teams. And if you're one of the final four teams, you're a contender. So I think, and now you have a team that's kind of built around him more, where it's like players that fit better, players that clearly have a specific identity, right? Where they play both ends of the floor really hard. Guys like DiVincenzo, uh, Ananobi, Josh Hart, Hartenstein, McBride. So there's a lot to like about the roster. It's just, for the offseason, you just have a couple of questions. One, run it back versus kind of, chasing a star. They have picks, so they have assets where they can move to bring in somebody. So you could do that if you wanted to, or you could kind of just run it back and just kind of hope for better health, right? Because you could, because obviously you got to re-sign Anunoby, you have to re-sign Hartenstein. You don't want those guys to walk. They were a big part of your team's success. Hartenstein clearly proved he can be a starting caliber center. He was great all season for the Knicks, especially while Mitchell Robinson was out. So you need to, and I think you don't want to just go into next season with just Robinson and Jericho Sims essentially as your centers. So I think you bring back Hartenstein, you know, assuming he's not going to cost like 25 million a year, which I don't think he will.
Right.
You bring him back. You bring back Anunoby. He's probably not going to get the 40 or whatever million it was that some people were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But he's still going to get a decent amount because you
Mm-hmm.
need to keep him back, keep him and bring him back. And he's worth it. So you re-sign him, bring those guys back, and then you just kind of build from there, right? Maybe you bring in a few other guys to kind of swap places on the team because we know now this seems like a team that I think people would want to play for, right? I think there's a lot of people who would want to come to New York and kind of, be a big part of this team and this group and this culture. So they've built a lot of stuff and they should continue to build. And again, it's rough because, I do think if they were healthier, they would have gotten further. But that's the tough part of the playoffs is sometimes that doesn't work out. And that's a big part of the playoffs is, who's left, who's remaining in terms of who's on your team. But just for the Knicks, just kind of rough that everything kind of came crashing down, right? Where it even ends with, again, Brunson fracturing his hand. So, he's going to be out for a while. So either way, you tip your hat to the Pacers. Halliburton's aggressiveness early on was really key. Him and Siakam both showed up big time in this game. I mean, pretty much all the, rotational guys played pretty well. But initially, the tone was set by your stars, which is what you want in a game seven. Because with Halliburton, he took a lot of flack, after the game five performance where he was pretty much invisible.
Mm-hmm.
And he showed up and showed out in a big way in game seven in a way that you didn't know if he was going to do. And aggressive Halliburton, that's the best one. Because obviously there's going to be some games where it's like you're just not going to score because maybe the shot's not falling, but you can't be invisible, right? Like that's the one thing. Because it's one thing, if you're, 8 for 25 or something, like, yeah, it happens. But you can't be like, 1 for 6 or like, 4 for 6 or something because that just means that you just weren't doing right.
Right.
So shout out to a lot of the Pacers guys, even a guy like a Miles Turner who was great so far in the postseason, all season for Indiana, where he was in so many trade rumors, and now he's clearly found a home here in Indiana. And obviously Siakam, right? These are the type of games for where this is why you traded for him because in a game seven he was very composed, made a lot of really good decisions, smart decisions. And whenever they kind of needed something to kind of go through him, he more than delivered. E. Smith shot 8 for 8, which is nuts, and it didn't even really feel like he was doing a whole lot, even though he did because he was playing good defense. But for the Pacers, also T.J. McConnell, could have been an All-Star in the 1960s, but he's a really good backup point guard. And it's on to the second round, or excuse me, the conference finals against the Celtics, where it's going to be a lot tougher of a matchup because the Celtics don't have Porzingis, but they got pretty much everybody else. And even without Porzingis, that's a really tough team to try to beat.
Yeah, 100%. And with the Knicks, I think it's crazy. I've never seen a team kind of, lose a series, and especially the way that they did, but still have so much stock. I have a lot of stock, and I think everybody in the who follows the NBA has a lot of stock and belief in the Knicks. And the online sentiment is, run it back. Run it back fully healthy. Bring back the guys that you need to bring back. Maybe you can potentially move on from Randall during a deadline or something like that if you really think that he's just not the answer at all. Because there is a pathway we talked about in the live stream where there's a path where you can upgrade from Julius Randle to a more of a system guy, just like how you did with RJ Barrett and OG Anunoby, and then there's a guy that fits that kind of culture. But at the end of the day, you don't walk away from this series feeling horrible at all. You did your job, you competed, and you played through a lot of injuries, and they just caught up, unfortunately. But if you're Indiana, I think you have to be riding high. I would ignore all the hate, put on the blinders, because I know a lot of people have been yapping and talking about, oh yeah, they've had such an easy run of things, with injury luck and stuff like that. You can't hold that against Indiana regardless. They don't choose who gets hurt. Nobody chooses who gets hurt. The injuries happen. You play with the cards you're dealt, and you just keep it pushing. So I don't understand that sentiment.
Talked about it in the live stream where it was it's a lose-lose, because if you win, then you don't get much credit because you beat shorthanded teams. But if you lose, you get roasted beyond belief, because it's like, how could you lose to this team? So you're in a lose-lose spot. But, like you said, for the Pacers, this is all still valuable playoff experience, because this is a team that hasn't had, this group, right, hasn't really been to the playoffs together. This is kind of their first go at it. And they're checking a lot of the boxes, in a way where you're winning the series, but you still don't ignore the injuries. But at the end of the day, if you're the Pacers, again, this is why you make a big move like that at the deadline, because you just never know, right?
Yeah.
Because this always happens every year where something breaks some team's way, and then all of a sudden you look up, and then it's like, this team's in the conference finals, right? Like, just like Dallas, right? Where it's like, they make a big move at the deadline, and then you look up and you're like, this team got this far, and it's like, they're a really good team.
Yeah, those swing moves are insane.
Yeah, exactly. So now they're going to be in an interesting matchup against the Celtics. But before we get into the conference finals matchups, right? We got to get into another Game 7, and this one was the biggest one of all, right? Because this was the battle, I think, of two heavyweights. We both have said multiple times that we thought whoever would come out of this series would be more likely to win the title. Could be wrong, but we'll see. We both picked the Nuggets to win this series. You had them in 7, I had them in 6. And it was Minnesota, or that ended up winning 98-90. A wild game, where I think this went pretty much how nobody would have expected. It was a lower scoring game, which we didn't know. We knew that was going to happen, right? Because we knew Minnesota is a very good defensive team. When Denver locks in, they can be a really good defensive team. So we knew it was going to be low scoring. What we didn't expect was, the absolute monster swings that happened over the course of the game, right? Because initially Minnesota kind of throws the first punch, then Denver battles back, right? And then kind of stays afloat, right? Where like they're missing some open shots early, but then they're just getting to the paint, getting everything they wanted. Jamal Murray's cooking, hitting every shot, and then it's a 15-point lead at halftime, and then third quarter starts, kind of wondering what's about to happen. Then Denver goes up 20. And it feels like at that point, it's kind of feels like the game might be over, because it's like, Minnesota's offense, you have 38 points through the first 2 quarters. Nothing's going. Edwards is horrible. It's basically kind of just like Towns, and then like Gobert drawing fouls, keeping you afloat. Then something happens. All of a sudden, Minnesota goes on a huge run, where again they win it with their defense, right? Where all of a sudden the lead's cut, from like 20, down to like 15, down to 7, down to 10, and then eventually they cut it to like 1 point, right, going into the fourth quarter, and you knew by that point, okay, this is a game where now this is anybody's game. Does it go to overtime? Does a team just pull it out in the end? And it's like Minnesota ends up, going up by as much as 10 late in the fourth quarter. And Denver, all the concerns that you may have had, in terms of reasons for why they weren't going to go back to back, right? Lack of a deep, the lack of depth, the fatigue of having to go, 2 years in a row making deep playoff runs, facing a team that is a tough matchup because they have the size and athleticism and length to be able to bother you. And all that kind of, just in the second half, Denver fell apart. The paint went away. They were forced into taking a lot of jump shots, mainly threes. None of them fell, right? Michael Porter Jr. 1 for 6. Joker 2 of 10 from three. Didn't shoot well from three at all in this series, which was kind of another swing. We talked about PJ Washington, Derek Jones Jr. shooting well from three. If Jokic, makes more of his threes over the course of this series, that could have been a swing. KCP 1 for 4. Jamal Murray 4 for 12. And again, a lot of that's still credit to Minnesota's defense, where they take away the paint. You're not getting anything inside in the second half. No offensive rebounds. We're getting offensive rebounds, and we're battling, for every possession. Jaden McDaniel shows up 3 of 4 from three, which was kind of a question mark because he was shooting, before game six, 38% from the field in the series. Karl Anthony Towns, what would he do in a game seven? He ends up flipping the narrative because a lot of people were kind of questioning, can this guy be a real winning player? And he made a lot of big plays in this game. Kind of again, because Edwards was 6 of 24. He had 16 points. And some of that was late, some of that was some breakaways. He did some other stuff: 8 rebounds, 7 assists, 2 steals, great defense on Jamal Murray in the second half, which is a big part of again superstar production, even in a game where you don't have to score 40 points, but you have to at least impact the game in a positive way, which he did. But then also, Mike Conley making some big plays in the fourth quarter. He even had 8 rebounds, right? One of the smallest player on the floor with 8 rebounds. Naz Reid in the fourth quarter scoring most of his points, right? During a really crucial stretch where Denver was down, but they were getting back into the game, and it was like, here comes the Nuggets.
Hmm.
Um, but Rudy Gobert, that's the other guy where it's like, we talked about, this stretch for the Mavs validates the Kyrie trade, right? Winning this series, completely validates the Rudy Gobert trade because they made this trade with the thought in mind of we need more size to compete with a team like Denver. Um, we have a guy in Towns that can space the floor. So even though it's kind of a clunky fit at times, we also have a superstar in Edwards who's good enough to kind of play through all that. And Gobert was a huge part of getting Minnesota back in this game on both ends of the floor, right? 3 of 7 from the field, which doesn't sound amazing. But, again, he made big plays on both ends of the floor. He was 7 of 9 from the free throw line. A lot of those were in the fourth quarter when, at different points, Minnesota was kind of looking for baskets. And, he came up with them, right? He had a crazy turnaround shot. These are shots that the Nuggets typically tend to make, which are backbreaking, in their own right. But, Minnesota was able to hang around, and they took out the Nuggets at home on their home turf. Right, this doesn't normally happen. Right, if you're the Nuggets, losing 3 games at home, in kind of 2 of them in similar-ish fashion, um, that's rough, and that's kind of the series there. But at the end of the day, Minnesota kind of showed they're at least of right now, they're the better team. And again, neither team's bench played that amazing. But Naz Reid, again, coming off the bench, this was an X factor that we talked about. Does he kind of just show up and all of a sudden hit, some big shots and make some big plays when nobody for the Nuggets bench, stepped up? So for Minnesota, this was a tough opponent, right? Because the Nuggets are going to test you in every single way, and Minnesota really, passed all the marks, right? They checked all the boxes and they did everything they needed to do in order to win this series because they needed to be aggressive defensively. They needed to make plays on offense, timely plays on offense, um, and they needed to be tough, right? And this was a question that some people had, but again, they learned from last year. Obviously, they're healthier than they were last year and better. And again, a lot of guys kind of flipped the narratives around because again, people were already starting to come at Gobert and Towns in different ways, right? Because people were starting to call Gobert a fraudulent defensive player. Obviously people were kind of criticizing Towns for boneheaded plays that he makes, but all these guys showed up in the biggest game of the year, so you give them props, especially on the road because that doesn't normally happen. And they ended up winning it decisively, where there was no question by the time that they went up 10, you knew it was over and that Denver had nothing left. Because again, Jokic didn't, he had 34 and 19 and 7, but I thought in the second half he didn't play quite as well, right? A lot of threes didn't go in. And you could tell some of that, I'm sure, was fatigue, right? Murray obviously in the second half didn't do as much, but then also you look around, Michael Porter Jr., pretty much a no-show. Did have 9 rebounds and 2 blocks, but you needed him to hit some shots, and he didn't. He got good looks, but none of them fell. Aaron Gordon, only 5 points and 4 rebounds, right? Wasn't his best performance. And now, if you're the Nuggets, you got a lot of questions where you're going into the offseason where it's like, okay, we're not quite as good as we thought. right? Because they had a lot of confidence going into this season. Because you heard them, right? They were talking a lot after winning the title last year, um, and it didn't come through for them this time around. So now, you have a question about KCP. He's got a player option. Does he stay and opt in, or does he opt out? Right? Does he take a shorter term deal, or a shorter, like a longer term deal for less
Yeah.
money, or does he bounce? Because somebody decides to pay him like 2 years and like I don't know 30 million or something like that. I don't know. For Denver, got to find a way to get some bench help. None of the guys you drafted were able to help you at all, right? Christian Brown helped him out last year as a rookie, but none of their rookies this year helped him out. Um, but again, when you don't have cap space, it's kind of what you get, right? Not in a bad way, but like, all five of their guys are making lots of money. And some of those guys are going to be due for extension, right? I think Murray's going to be due for an extension pretty soon. Gordon's going to be due for an extension pretty soon. And, and now you're not quite as good as you think you are, right? Obviously, again, it's hard to go back to back anyway. So maybe you just rest up and kind of see what you do next year. Um, but, again, it just they ended up having nothing left in the tank because last year they were able to kind of coast the second half of the year, but they couldn't do that this time around because they had to pretty much give everything they had in order to try to get the 1 seed, and they didn't get it, and it ended up costing them because if they had the 1 seed, you don't play Minnesota until maybe the conference finals, and that's assuming they didn't get knocked out. But instead, you have to go against the Lakers in the first round, even though that was a 5-game series, the Lakers, gave them a tough 5 games, I guess. And then you go against a team in Minnesota, which was built to beat you. And now they've beaten you. So now you kind of have to go back to the drawing board and kind of figure out where can you add on to this team. Obviously some more depth, maybe a backup big, maybe another backup wing, because I think that's also kind of something that would probably help, right? Because, can you have, Christian Brown and another wing out there, as opposed to just Christian Brown being the wing? Peyton Watson. That was a guy that they were kind of banking on taking a leap forward this year, and he wasn't ready. Right, he played in the playoffs early on, and then he couldn't play because he was hitting shots off the side of the backboard, and you at least got to hit your open shots, right? And you just can't have that many guys on a team where nobody really has to guard them because you already have Gordon, who nobody guards at least from the three, and he didn't take any threes, but again, that's where you kind of have to find some ways to upgrade. Maybe one of their drafted guys takes the step forward. But all the credit to Minnesota because they showed up big boy style in this series where I didn't know if they had it in them, but they did, and you got to tip your hat because this was a really tough game. Because again, down 20 in the second half, you don't usually come back from something like that, and they came back pretty quickly. They cut that lead, in over the course of what 7 minutes or something like that.
Yeah.
Um, and then it was anybody's game, and like I said, it validates the Gobert trade and kind of quiets a lot of the criticisms that he had because he was good against the Suns in the first round. And again, I thought he was good in this round, right? Like even in Game 5, like he played good defense on Jokic, but Jokic just had all-time performance. But
Right.
this time around, he got the best of him. So that's where you give a lot of credit to that guy and for having a bounce back year as well, right? Because last year he wasn't as good. Some of that a lot of people say was because he wasn't healthy, but clearly he's been a lot better this year, and this is the good version of Gobert that helps your team on both ends of the floor. Where now he's not getting played off the floor because a lot of people even after the first half were saying like this guy can't play,
Hmm.
um, because the offense is getting mucked up, but they stuck with him, and he rewarded them because he had a really great performance for them.
Yeah, and you look at the defense all around from Minnesota. It was amazing. They were able to create turnovers and get points off of that as well. The rebounding was solid as well. And they're basically playing catch up, which is the amazing thing. And that's the phenomenal thing that I really love about it. But overall, team defense. Anthony Edwards didn't have the best offensive game in terms of scoring and efficiency, but like you talked about multiple times, like the guy was doing everything else. And on top of that, he took care of the ball. He had one turnover. It was pretty stupid, cross court pass, but that was the only one. That's the only glaring turnover that he had. And it's really tough, considering what these guys are able to do with their length and their athleticism on both ends of the floor. I think it's very special. Jaden McDaniels is the best version of him that you could possibly ask for. Efficient from the three, efficient from the field, and doing some insane stuff on defense as well. And, it's funny. I liked what Denver did in the first half against the Timberwolves. defensively, but they just lost their identity completely. And you could really feel the tide turning like very, very quickly. You know, Denver, they came out and I think they had like a stretch of like 5 or 7 minutes where they just didn't score. And you were like, what the heck is going on? And then, you know, you talked about it. The Gobert turnaround was insane. The game was over at that point, if you want me to be real. Like, when people are hitting shots like that, that's when you kind of feel the crushing blows, and you're like, yeah, there's no shot that we're going to come back from this. And it's just over, and you just lost the momentum. Everything, turnovers, sloppy, fast break points, easy buckets. It's just kind of the recipe and the ebb and flow of basketball. But at the end of the day, you know, the Timberwolves, they did their job. You know, they were created to do this. And they did it beautifully and in the best way possible, I think, you know, giving us 7 games, very entertaining. Although, you know, the margins were very different throughout stretches of the series. But at the end of the day, I think this is the best kind of game 7 that you would want, where it's not a high scoring blowout. It's not, you know, somebody getting blown off the floor. It's a competitive game, you know, and a tale of two stories, you know, where you have a first half where one team is dominating and a second half where another one is. But at the end of the day, it's about who closes, who's the better team, who executes better, and who comes with a stronger game plan. You look at Minnesota, everybody showed up, like you talked about. Everybody who played significant minutes, except for Nickeil Alexander-Walker, pretty much showed up and did their goddamn job. And that's what you want. You know, you have Naz Reid, the 6th man of the year. Great candidate, great pick for it. Definitely deserved. He showed it in this game. You know, he showed up when it mattered. Gobert, Depoy, he did his thing. Anthony Edwards ascending, doing more than just being a scorer and a freak athlete. Towns being efficient, you know, not from the 3, but efficient, getting rebounds, doing his job. And it's just amazing to really see the development, I think, of all of these guys and what they've been able to do coming together and giving them, you know, a great full season where everybody's kind of on the ascension. And it's just been amazing to see. And, you know, Denver, they tried, and I think they had it, but it was a botch job. Like, you could really tell they just sold and cracked in half completely, really.
I mean, again, losing a 20-point lead in the second half, you know,
Drop the ball, bro.
I mean, that happened to they came back down 20 against LA. You know, and now this time they were on the receiving end of it in a game 7. But
the irony,
interesting, right? Where it's like, I think it's pretty definitive where, you know, this year's Nuggets were not as good, right? Where, you know, and obviously they didn't face a team like Minnesota last year. But I think, you know, just in general, like, you know, the first round, even though they won in 5, like it felt kind of weird, right? Because like it didn't feel like, you know, the Nuggets that we had seen last year, right? Where it's like a lot of games where they start off really slow and they're coming from behind. It just, you know, versus last year, and I think some of that was Jamal Murray just was kind of inconsistent over the course of the postseason. Obviously, you know, he played much better in this game, even though in the second half he was quiet. But you know, I don't know. It just sometimes it's just not your year. And, you know, it wasn't their year this time around. It's just, again, they're going to still be around. It's not like they're not going to be a factor, you know, in the championship contention next season. It's just, it's not going to happen this year. Once again, we got another defending champion knocked out, right? This is what, the 5th season in a row, right? Because we had the Raptors in 2019 knocking out the Warriors, the Lakers winning in 2020. Obviously, the Raptors didn't make the finals. You know, then the Bucks winning in 21, the Warriors winning in 22, Nuggets in 23. Now it's a question mark, right? And I think kind of the wild part is, you know, as we get into these conference finals matchups in a moment, is um every team that's left, you know, is a team where the main guy hasn't been a champion yet. So we're gonna have somebody where it's not only like, you know, somebody who didn't win last year, it's also somebody who's never won a title. So somebody's gonna get their first ring this year, whether, you know, it's Luca, whether it's you know, uh Edwards and Towns, whether or not it's, you know, Tatum and Brown or Halliburton. It's going to be, you know, something that we haven't seen before, right? Because, you know, I mean, I guess last year, you know, like the Nuggets hadn't won a title, or, you know, they hadn't won a title before. But, you know, they were kind of a team that had been in the playoffs for a while, right? I guess Minnesota's been in the playoffs before, but they were a first round exit every year the last, you know, 2, 3 seasons, right? But this time around, like you said, they've ascended to, now that they've gotten all those scars the previous postseasons, now they're ready and you know, to make a championship run, right? Because we both said that we think that the team that won that series is probably going to go on to win the championship.
They proved
and we'll
it.
see.
You know, once
Yeah,
you take
you
out
know,
that defending champ, you're in a different category, I think.
yeah. Exactly. So I think that's, kind of how we look at it. So now we got the conference finals to look forward to where, only 4 teams left. And so in the East, you got Indiana, Boston. In the West, you got Dallas, OKC. In the East, I think Boston's going to win that series, right? It may go 6.
Hmm.
Um, just because Indiana's got more bodies than the teams that Boston faced before, and Boston still will be without Porzingis for a couple of games. But I think Indiana's going to have a tough time slowing down Boston. Defensively, I think they'll probably be able to score with them. Although Boston is a very good defensive team, so if Boston is a team like Minnesota where they can turn their defense into offense, where they can get stops, get out and run. Tatum and Brown on the break and transition. It's going to be tough to stop for Indiana.
Yeah.
Um, so again, it's going to be obviously different than a shorthanded Knicks team that challenged the Pacers and gave them everything. And so maybe that might be why maybe it won't be a 6 game series. Maybe it'll be a quicker series. But I think Indiana, just because of the offensive explosions, they could have a game where they just, hit a crazy amount of shots, just kind of run Boston out of the gym. Their bench plays really well. And they win a game or two, where Halliburton's really good. But, it's going to be a tall task, I think, for Indiana. Um, and for Boston, right again, the path to the finals, kind of continues to be kind of a, relatively low resistance path, right? Where you're going against, shorthanded teams that aren't quite as good. Not that they wouldn't get past these teams anyways. And again, they're not the first team to kind of have luck in terms of making a deep run. Like that has happened almost every year where somebody gets the benefit, of playing teams in a way where they end up going further than expected. It happens. That's you need luck in order to win a title. It's kind of put Boston in an interesting spot where I feel like a lot of people outside of Boston are lower on the team, right? Where like everybody knows and understands that they're really good, but how good are they when they end up facing a team in the West?
Hmm.
I don't know. But that's obviously a question for another day. But how do you feel about this matchup? Because I think there's some interesting things going into it because it's a tale of 2 teams that are kind of different. But at the same time, there's things to like about Indiana in some of these games. I just don't feel like they're going to have enough to be able to win 4. But I think they could definitely give them a couple. I think. But either way, if you're Indiana, you're playing with house money now, right? Where it's like you're probably not even supposed to be here, so there's not really any pressure at this point, right? All the pressure's on Boston because they're the team that's supposed to win, and do it pretty quickly, which they probably will. But if you're Indiana, right, like that has to make you feel good. Where it's like now, you kind of got through some tough matchups. Obviously, they had luck in terms of injuries, but this is their toughest task yet because even though the Boston doesn't have Porzingis, they still have everybody else, and the other guys that they have are still really good,
Yeah.
especially because they still have 2 of their 3 best players waiting
Yeah.
for you.
And I
And their
think,
matchup at Indiana, I don't think is going to have a big answer for.
yeah, and I think this is going to probably be the series where I think Tatum finds his rhythm when it comes to his efficiency. He hasn't been that efficient this postseason, but overall, I think his numbers have been great because he's been doing a lot of other things, whether it be like rebounding, playmaking, and especially playing a lot better defense, in my opinion. But in terms of his efficiency, I think this is probably where he finds that rhythm because we already know Indiana's not the best defensive team. But if you look at it kind of from Indiana's perspective, I think, the Porzingis factor is interesting. I think there's a way that Miles Turner can kind of be the turning point in the X factor, the swing guy, where it's like, if he kind of takes advantage of the fact that Al Horford's a little bit up in age, hey, we might have ourselves a little bit of a series because if Tyrese Halliburton can get going, and I feel like Tyrese Halliburton is a curious case as well, because, you think about him, he kind of has the problem that a lot of superstars, don't necessarily have. And it's more so he doesn't know when to score. He knows when to play make, but he just doesn't know when to score and be aggressive. So if he can kind of flip that switch and keep it on, I think this will be a competitive series. But that's kind of banking on a lot of things to go Indiana's way. But at the end of the day, like you said, it'll probably be like Celtics in 5 or 6. I think 7 is a little bit too generous for Indiana, that is. But the Celtics, they're dominant. We know what kind of team they are. But I think the factor to watch is the Porzingis one. But at the end of the day, the Celtics have a lot of guys that can hound you. And a lot of guys that will literally destroy you on the offensive end. It's tough because you have Tatum who can explode, and I think he's due for an amazing peak playoff game. I think, Jaylen Brown is another one of those guys where we haven't really seen him, go off, like we normally have. And then Derek White, there's been times when he's been the best player on the Celtics roster. So keep an eye out for him as well, especially against the Indiana team where, they can't really defend a paperclip.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, then that's going to be the tough part where Indiana's really going to be tested on the defensive end because Boston has a lot of options that they can turn to,
Mm-hmm.
for offense where it's not really like a one-man show and then a bunch of other guys that kind of fit around them, right? It's a lot of guys that can kind of, like Tatum and Brown can pretty much get their own whenever they want. And even though like Holiday and Derek White aren't necessarily scorers, but they are guys that, Boston will often look to for offense at different points in the game, right? And
Yeah.
if they get mismatches, they're going to be able to attack them. Obviously, the threes are going to be interesting because obviously that's, a big part of Boston's offense, right? So if you're Indiana, how do you kind of limit the Celtics from three? I don't know. I mean, because it's going to be definitely, I think, a test for Indiana defensively. Because Neesmith, he's going to have his hands full, right? Nemhart, he's going to have his hands full. Miles Turner, trying to protect the rim. Siakam defensively, obviously he's got some length and skill and savvy to him as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. I think Indiana's definitely going to be tested, and I can see them getting a couple of games, but I just don't see them winning this series.
Yeah.
But if you're Boston, I feel like if the Knicks were healthy, that's the team that you wouldn't have wanted to face. I think with Indiana, like the ceiling is probably lower, but the floor may be higher right now just because like they have more bodies. Like if the Knicks were healthy, I think if you're Boston, you'd be terrified. Not that you would lose, but I think going against a team like the Pacers, where they just probably aren't going to be able to have ways to slow you down, I think you'd rather face that.
Yeah.
But obviously the Knicks, you'd probably rather face that considering what's left of them at this point. But it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't really matter if you're Boston and you're the team that everybody thinks that you can be. Like you're going to win this series regardless, even if Porzingis doesn't play at all, because you're a
Sure.
better team. So
Exactly. Yeah. It's kind
yeah,
of like where you're going in as like a supreme favorite. You need to do this. Like this is a must win, and this is kind of like what I was saying. This is a series I think where Boston needs to really prove that they're a huge and dominant team. Don't drop any games. Like simple as that. Take care of business as well.
yeah,
That way you get to
pretty much.
rest.
Yeah, essentially win the series in a way where you can get out and in one piece, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you don't lose any more guys. Just basically win the series, do what you need to do to be able to win four times, and don't let it go to like 6-7. Ideally, like kind of end it when you need to, because
Yeah.
otherwise, if you let teams hang around, sometimes they might be able to catch you, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of the lesson learned if you're like the Nuggets, where it's like you're up 20 and you're starting to kind of go away from what was working. Obviously, you can still give credit to Minnesota, but then before you know it, you're done. So,
Mm-hmm.
and then obviously we got another big series in the West, Minnesota versus Dallas, right? This time around, Minnesota's going to have home court. Um, and obviously they just took out the defending champs, so now they're going against another matchup where you're going against a team that's got one of the best players in the NBA, very different player, right? This time it's more of a perimeter-oriented guy in Luca, who's got size and skill, at the guard spot. It's flanked by Kyrie Irving, so that's probably the best perimeter duo in the league, for sure, right? And they're flanked by some athletes and defenders, so it's a very different matchup compared to Denver, right? Because it's like Dallas's third best player, their supporting cast probably isn't as good as like Denver's starting five, but I think they have more guys that are a little bit more playable at different spots. And then obviously you have two guys that you can kind of rely on from the perimeter. But they also, can attack the basket, and get to the line or, score at the rim or whatever. And it's going to be a very different team in terms of how they're going to test Minnesota defensively, right? Because Dallas can overwhelm you a lot more from three in a way that the Nuggets don't. Not that the Nuggets can't make threes, but they're not as high volume or as good of a 3-point shooting team as Dallas is. So like for Minnesota, that works for you because you can take away the paint pretty well because you got size and rebounding. But for Dallas, they can kind of overwhelm you from the outside, and that's where like if they get hot from three, then that might be really tough for Minnesota to be able to win some of those games because
Right.
you're just not going to have the personnel probably to match that. Um, you know, and they don't have the same paint presence where they don't have like a guy that you dump the ball to in the post. but you have a guy in Gafford that can be physical, that can kind of force things. He can get rebounds, he can catch lobs. So there's a level of athleticism that Denver probably, where like, not that Dallas is a more athletic team, but I feel like they have more collective athleticism than Denver. And I think they have way better rim protection as well, and more and different guys to put out there. They have a backup in Lively where even though he's not a physical guy, he's a good athlete, can get you rebounds, can run the floor, block shots. Um, Obviously, again, PJ Washington is a tough guy that can, space the floor and defend, run the floor, right? Derek Jones Jr., obviously is a really special athlete as well that's now added some skill and some defense to his game. So, there's a lot to like about this Dallas matchup. That being said, I think we're both, well, I'm only going to speak for myself. I'm picking Minnesota. Um, they showed a lot, I think, in terms of taking out the defending champs. And I think that bodes really well for the confidence. And I think you're going to start seeing some guys, have a little bit more consistent performances, possibly, making big plays. It's, again, very different team compared to Denver, that will test you in a very different way. But I feel like Minnesota is still better, although Dallas was really good post trade deadline. And, if you stretch that out to an entire season, that could possibly be like a team that's like a top three, or whatever in the West. Even though they're the 5 seed, some of that was because of how they started the year. But um, either way, this should be a very competitive series. Like I said, it's going to be very different than the other one, but I think it should still be pretty competitive because it's kind of two teams that are very different from each other. Not that Denver is similar to Minnesota. It's just like again, Dallas is so much more perimeter oriented, and they're especially again not just the three, but also like it's guards, right? It's guard play combined with some forward and big man depth, in a way where like Denver doesn't have the depth, even though their starting five is better and they have the best player. So I think this is, again, Minnesota's bench is going to be a key factor, right? But Dallas can kind of match the size in the second units as well and not really sacrifice a whole lot by adding size because they can still have size and shooting. So, you know, we'll see. But, I'm picking Minnesota, and I think Edwards, he lit up Denver multiple times, didn't do it in game 7, but, I don't really see him having, like, a super difficult time against this Dallas defense either. Obviously, at the rim, I think it will be tougher, um, but at the same time, right, guys are probably gonna have a tough time staying in front of him on the perimeter, and then just, again, the extra size that Minnesota has, I feel like it's not gonna be as easy for Dallas to get the extra chances and offensive rebounds that they got against OKC. So I'm expecting, again, another really good Minnesota performance on the way to the finals. But I still give Dallas a lot of credit, and I give them, a good chance. Vegas actually favors Dallas, which is interesting. Um, Maybe they might be factoring in how much energy does Minnesota have left after a really brutal 7-game series, even though they'll be going back home. But I don't know. I think and again, like with Dallas, like you have a guy in Luke who's 25 who's been in more playoff games, but this was a big test for Minnesota and they passed it, and I think they're going to pass this other hurdle as well.
Yeah, it's hard not to pick Minnesota because of the fact that they just beat the defending champs, and both these teams have deserve to be here. Dallas and Minnesota, that is for sure. Like, there's no way that you can argue that they shouldn't be here. And the tough part is though, you look at the regular season numbers. Luka destroyed the Timberwolves. Like it was bad. He only played in I think 2 of the matchups or whatever, but he averaged 36 points, 10 assists, 6 rebounds on 50% shooting from the field. So, and the guy who was on him was Jaden McDaniels. But the beautiful thing about that is I think this Minnesota team and the Dallas Mavericks team as well, they're different from what they were in the regular season. If you want to be real, the intensity is different, the hunger is different. It's a whole different environment as well. And the Timberwolves, they tried to rotate multiple guys on Luka, but nobody could stop him. And I think that's kind of going to be the similar trend here, where I think Luka is probably going to get his, but will the other guys? That's the question. I think the biggest question is are the supporting cast going to show up? Because this is kind of the trend that we've seen with the Minnesota Timberwolves, where they tend to play a lot of these teams like say the Suns or the Nuggets. They have a lot of star power, but then you look around and look at the game 7 that we just talked about. Where the supporting guys, they didn't show up because they got put in a box. Simple as that. They made it tough for them. No easy shots, no easy points for the guys who aren't, the number one and number two options. So that's a huge factor as well. But I think there are built-in advantages that Dallas does have. Kyrie Irving is one of them. That's an unguardable guy alongside
Yeah.
another unguardable guy. That's going to be tough. And they have some defensive personnel as well. Like you talked about with the three-point shooting, it's crazy. But at the same time, I think there's a pathway where Minnesota's going to slow down the pick and roll. Not necessarily stop it, but slow it to the point where, you could potentially see a pathway where it bothers the guys. And I'm not necessarily talking about Luka. Maybe Gafford or, Lively gets bothered a little bit because the clear advantage that Minnesota has is the bigs. The quality of the bigs is better. And also, I do want to give Towns his flowers. I think he is the highest three-point percentage in playoffs right now. So he's the best three-point shooter in the playoffs right now. He's been playing out of his mind from three. That needs to continue as well. He needs to be probably third best player, honestly, if they want to win this series. He needs to be there on both ends of the floor, which is a tall task for him, I think, considering that the other guys in the series are going to be Anthony Edwards, Luka Doncic, and Kyrie Irving. That's hard to be the third best, but if he shows up on both ends of the floor along with his, co-partner in Gobert, I think, Minnesota wins this one. But at the end of the day, it's going to be close. It's going to be tight. Dogfight, 7, Minnesota.
Yeah. I mean, because again, like going back to the Dallas stuff, like say,
Mm-hmm.
like you said, the pick and roll, right? Like Luka could get can get those bigs switched on them,
Mm-hmm.
and that might take them out of the paint, and that might open up looks, around the basket for other guys, or Luka can just go one on one, against some of these dudes. But again, like
One thing.
yeah,
But also keep in mind, Minnesota has something that, maybe the Clippers didn't have, or,
right,
some other teams like where it's like Jaden McDaniels. He's going to
yeah,
be the primary defender on Luka. We kind of
yep,
already addressed that. If he's playing drop or switching, that's a completely different monster than Mike Conley. You know what I mean?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Because and that's going to be a big factor. Because like you said, there's things that both teams can do. It just kind of comes down to again, like some of the supporting cast. Because like PJ Washington and Derek Jones Jr. Can they keep up that 3-point shooting?
Mm-hmm.
Because I have to do that if they want to win the series. Because those guys, were killers against Oklahoma City, where the defense is, leaving these guys open because they don't, they would rather, if we're going to lose a series, we'd rather lose because PJ Washington and Derek Jones Jr. hit shots that they're not supposed to hit versus, just having Luka and Kyrie just go one on one and putting, and torturing guys. Um, but sometimes it doesn't work out. But if it continues, right, then that might give an edge towards the Mavs. But I just feel like there's stuff defensively that Minnesota can get to that OKC just couldn't because of the lack of size, where it may not even necessarily matter. Plus, Minnesota's size can punish Dallas, I think, a little bit more. Where again, like offensive rebounds or even drawing fouls, right? Like Gobert drew fouls at different points in Game 7, where it's like it puts Minnesota in the bonus. Or like even if Minnesota doesn't score, like you just give trips to the line or you put guys in foul trouble, and that makes guys a little bit different in how they have to guard guys, right? So
Yeah.
I mean, just little stuff like that, is where Minnesota can have the edge. And also, again, having Game 7 at home, even though they just won a Game 7 on the road, that's always nice to have. In addition, as opposed to having to go out on the road again,
Mm-hmm.
in order to make a possible run to the finals.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so that's pretty much it for the conference finals matchups. These should be good ones, right? Because again, these are the four remaining teams. I guess essentially the four best remaining teams. Or I guess the four most fortunate teams. Who are trying to win a title this year. So again, it's going to be really interesting. Again, another year where the defending champ goes out, right? Kind of showing the NBA's mission, right, to create more parity, right, in the NBA, where it's not the same team that wins the title every year, and it's a lot tougher to guess who's going to win the title, right? And it has been, right? Because it's been somebody different every year. Oftentimes, the team that won the title doesn't even go back to the finals, right? Let alone, win another one. So, and that's kind of and sometimes injuries is a factor or, other types of bad luck, but this is what the NBA wants, right? And also with the new CBA, it becomes a lot tougher, to continuously just spend a boatload of money and continue to bring in talent because now it's going to be a lot more punitive, right? Where you're going to lose draft picks. You're not going to be able to sign certain guys. You're not going to be able to make certain types of trades. But this is what the NBA wants. So,
Hmm.
and again, like I think, people are enjoying the postseason so far, or at least we are.
Yeah,
So
and it's a nice, good shakeup. Just seeing a different face potentially every year, and now we've got like all this young talent, and they're blossoming, and we're kind of seeing we're seeing the ascension, and I love to see it. That's all I really have to say on it.
yeah. So now moving on, news and rumors around the league, obviously before, we call it. So, again, as we kind of assumed, according to Mark Stein, lots of teams eyeing Jared Allen, right? Lots of rival teams interested in acquiring him, which makes sense. He's a good player. He's an all-star a few seasons ago. He can do a lot of things on both ends of the floor. Not really a shooter, but again, he's got size, at 6'9" or whatever. Well, I guess that's not that big for a center, but he's a good athlete.
Mm.
Can block shots, rebound. I think he's got 2 more years, 20 million a year or whatever. Still a young guy. And it makes sense, right? Because with the Cavs, it seems like that the front court duo of Mobley and Allen just doesn't really work. Both guys are good, they just can't play together. So I think there's a lot of teams that could use a guy like a Jared Allen because every team could use some type of option at the five. Especially if you don't have one at all. So I think there's going to be a ton of teams that are going to ask about him. I don't know what it's going to take to get him. And obviously, especially after seeing Minnesota, you want to make sure that you add more size. You don't want to be a
Hmm.
super small team. So, and again, he's not a 7 footer, right? I'm surprised because I don't know why. I always thought he was taller than six
I thought he
nine.
was
Maybe it's
six
just
eleven, bro. It's
yeah,
part of the pro
maybe
though.
yeah. I was gonna say maybe it's just the hair, but either way, I like him, so I think he can help out some teams. It's just a matter of I don't know where he's gonna go. Obviously, I know that there was some talks about some people were kind of annoyed at the fact that he wasn't gonna play in these games. But either way, he can help out a lot. I know a team that's been mentioned is New Orleans, right? Because a lot of people think that Valanciunas they're not gonna bring back. Maybe you replace him with Allen. Obviously, not a guy that spaces the floor, but he's just a better player. So if you're New Orleans, maybe you do that, or if you're another team, right? I don't see a reason why you wouldn't. And obviously for Cleveland, you got to figure stuff out anyways because what if you bring back Mitchell and extend him, right? Then there's talks about maybe you move on from Garland, and then you kind of try to make it work around Mitchell. So lots of questions for Cleveland, but I think if you are going to trade Allen, I think you can get something back for him because again, I think he's a guy where again, not a bad player at all. He's just on the wrong team.
Yeah. Do you think OKC could be in the bidding for him?
Yeah, I mean that could be another team. I don't know if OKC is looking for to move Chet to the four, right? Because
Hmm.
obviously that completely changes the dynamic of your team, and it seems like their identity is like we want guys that can do stuff with the ball in their hands, which isn't Allen. But you also look at it as like sometimes there's no problem with having just a center that can kind of just do stuff like roll to the rim, get
Right.
rebounds, block shots, like that can help,
Because that's where they
especially if
got
they're
punked.
yeah, especially if it's like a guy that, can be kind of physical. I don't know if he's, kind of considered a banging center, but,
No.
it'd be better than any of the other options that OKC had. So, yeah, a team like that, and they have the cap space to be able to just kind of bring him in. But I would think if you're Cleveland, you'd probably like something back as opposed to like OKC could just trade for him and just absorb his contract and,
Right.
only get back picks. So that which maybe you're okay with if you're moving on from Mitchell but, I don't know what, where Cleveland's head at is in
Yeah.
terms of so
Yeah. It's a bunch of factors.
yeah. Another Mark Stein rumor, Clint Capella likely to be on the market, right? Hawks big man bound to be in trade talks once again. Heard his name in trade talks, last year. And again, it's another center where it's not an elite center, but he's a guy that can defend, rebound, block some shots on a relatively solid contract. And we know, right? Like I think that there's going to be more teams that are going to look around for size. Doesn't make a ton of money, right? Averaged a double double the last several seasons. Still a limited offensive player, but again, if you can get him, and you don't necessarily have a lot of options in the front court, it wouldn't hurt to add a guy like that. Again, I like Allen more, but Capella's not a bad player at all. So, it's just, again, you have multiple options if you're a lot of these teams, but this one was different, right? Because it sounded more like Atlanta's looking to move him, not necessarily that a ton of teams are interested,
Right.
but somebody might be interested.
I think
Because
somebody would bite on it.
yeah. So, I mean, is there a team that you're kind of, or is it just probably kind of the same teams for Jared Allen, right?
Yeah.
Like
I'm
just
looking
any
at
team.
OKC. I'm looking at a team that needs size. It needs rebounds, because you need a traditional center, I think, on your team. At least one. It doesn't have to
Yeah,
be your starting. It could be your backup.
right.
Look at
Yeah,
what Dallas has done. They have two of them. But like
yeah,
that also tells me the Hawks are probably taking Sar number one. If they're looking to move on from Clint Capella, because I mean, what they have a Kongwu, right?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
They have
so they're gonna
Luka.
need a backup center or potentially a starting center, and you move or you keep a Kongwu as a backup.
Yeah. Again, Bronny could go round one, according to the LA Times.
Okay.
Team discussing possibility of taking James earlier than expected to lure LeBron in free agency. Again, I still feel like he resigns in LA, but I also think you factor in he's been good in the combine, so that would also probably kind of help in terms of his rise in the rankings. Because if he shows that he's got an NBA ready skill set, he's going to go a lot higher than what people would have initially anticipated, right? Even though he's kind of undersized, he's a pretty good athlete clearly, and he can clearly shoot and defend pretty well. So that's a good starting point to have. Even with the lack of height, and he still has long arms, so it's not like it's not the same as being like undersized but not that athletic, not that quick or whatever. It's a different ball game. So he can definitely, I think, help a lot of teams. I don't know where he's gonna go, and I don't know if it factors into like, hey, if OKC takes Bronny, does that mean LeBron signs with Oklahoma City? Like, I mean, I don't think so. But I mean, again, either way, um, if he shows that he can really contribute, you take him regardless.
Yeah, like putting the name aside and all that stuff, and the all the hype. I think he could be a solid prospect. He's one of the more raw ones, but he has shown and flashed a lot of potential. And the thing that I've heard that I agree with, and it rings, with me is like, he's plays basketball the right way. He makes the right play, and that's the way he was taught. Clearly, like you said, he may not be above average in those physical gifts and things like that. But I think his IQ is something that's probably going to put him a lot further than some other players that are probably going to be drafted before him and will probably be worse than him. But I don't think it's like a bad gamble to draft Bronny. Like I think he's going to be a solid player. It's just he's not going to be a superstar. I think he's going to be more of like a role player. And he even talked about it, like, his player comps, like talked about Davion Mitchell, I think, Derek White. It's like, if you're one of those guys, I think you're equally as valuable to a championship team as, your superstar. Because, you
Yeah,
need guys like that to make a run, like we've seen in the past.
yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
Every team could use a guy like a Jaden McDaniels. I'm not saying Bronny is Jaden McDaniels, but like just in general, like every team can use a guy that can play both ends of the floor.
100%.
Because those are the guys that can help you win games, right? I mean, like you said, or even look around elsewhere, right? Like PJ Washington, right? Like obviously, I know he was drafted, in a spot where maybe at times you might have expected more, but like he's clearly turned into like a really solid player.
Yeah, he's on a
Where
winning squad.
yeah, exactly. So so that bodes well, I think, for a guy like Brock.
Hmm.
And then moving on, Pistons narrow search for top exec, right? Detroit's down to four candidates. I don't, even though they mentioned the names, right? Like Trayon Langdon, Scott Perry, Dennis Lindsay, and John Hammond. I'm not going to pretend like I know who they are,
Hmm.
but I know and understand that, like, clearly they're looking for, you know, an additional direction to go in, right? Because what they've been doing hasn't worked. They've been awful. They've been really stinky. And it's time to probably add some additional help to that front office, to kind of make some decisions. And again, like they have some good players, but it seems like some of them haven't fit. Maybe some of them haven't necessarily panned out, right? Like there's stuff going around where like if a guy like a Sar or somebody is or some type of big is available for Detroit, maybe they trade Jalen Duren. I don't know if they're going to do that, but just in general, like there's you need a little bit of assistance, I think, in that front office for Detroit. Because again, like this could potentially be kind of a big year. Not that it's like a big year where you're going to the playoffs, but just like now you're kind of in a spot where what Cade is in year 4,
Hmm.
right? So presumably you're going to have to extend him. Some of the other guys are going to be in like year 2, year 3, where it's like what are these guys really going to be, right? Like Jaden Ivey's going to be in his 3rd season. What is he, right? Or say a Sore Thompson year 2. Killian Hayes isn't on the team anymore, so you don't really have to ask about that. But
Duran, that's a big
but
question.
Right, but just in general, like, what are some of these guys for Detroit gonna be? So, I think that's kind of where, where you want some additional voices in there just to kind of help figure some stuff out. Because it's not like everybody that they've taken is bad. That's not the case at all. It's just a matter of, what are we doing? What's the direction of this team? Where, like, what are we gonna do with the guys that we have? What's the next move?
Right. And yeah, you're also looking at this year's draft as well. Like, do you need more vets? Do you want to continue to pile on with the young guys? Like, you could go a multitude of directions. I think, you continue to just build through the draft. Unfortunately, your draft luck has been horrid, but, at the end of the day, you have a Cade Cunningham, and we already know the guy has shown a lot of potential. It's just, the system hasn't worked, the fit hasn't worked. Collectively, I think all the guys together, we already know they're the worst team in the NBA, but at the end of the day, on paper, you have talent. Find a way to maximize it. Find a way to maybe even move on from it to get even better talent. It all depends on, like you said, what is the sense of direction, and hiring new people is always a good way to determine that.
Yeah, exactly. So now, to kind of conclude, there's been a lot of talks about like, who might be the next Lakers, head coach. There've been names, thrown around like, say Mike Nori, right assistant for Minnesota, David Adelman, Denver assistant, Tyronn Lue if he becomes available. But there are some people that are going around, that have been saying that JJ Redick might be the front runner, right? Like I think Anthony Irwin of Lakers Daily, he's kind of mentioned this. And so there's kind of a, I think Jovan Buha of The Athletic has also said this as well, where as of right now, of course, I don't think they've done interviews yet. Um, but a lot of people, think that he might be the front runner, which, again, how do you react to that? Because, it's kind of it's a zag, right? Where it's like, obviously outside of Ty Lue, who isn't available right now,
Hmm.
a lot of these coaches, you don't necessarily know what it's going to look like because a lot of them haven't been head coaches before, other than what Atkinson. Um, but like but at the same time, like with JJ Redick, unlike those guys, he doesn't have any coaching experience at all, right? In
Hmm.
terms of professional. So there's a world where we've seen examples, say like a Steve Kerr, where it works, and you end up doing some really good things. But then we've also seen like a Steve Nash, right, where it's like in the first year it honestly was fine, right, but then obviously in the second year it all fell apart, and then he was gone. And for Reddick, it's kind of risky, right, because he had been offered some other opportunities, right, like Charlotte, and Toronto, and if you take those offers, doesn't really hurt you if you have kind of a rough first year or two, because those are rebuilding teams. But if you're the Lakers, right, there's going to be a lot of pressure to kind of do good now, right? Like Darvin Ham in year one, they got to the conference finals, right? So if JJ Redick is the coach next year and they are in the play-in again, go out in the first round or miss the playoffs or whatever, right, then it's like, if he ends up getting fired relatively quickly, that may be it.
But if he
So
gets fired at that point, it's not even a coaching issue, in my opinion. That's more of a
yeah,
roster construction and
right,
the execution factor of things, and the players. But like,
right.
I don't know if you've heard, like, you're tapped in with the Lakers, obviously. You follow it daily, and I'm sure a lot of other Lakers fans do. But the LA Times piece was hilarious. I think it was from the what's his, I can't pronounce his last name. It's like Bill Plash or something like that.
Bill Plaschke, yeah, I think
Yeah,
he's kind of a guy that like people are like,
yeah,
some Laker fans are like, where they're always kind of like, more pessimistic.
yeah. And it's
Uh,
like, I mean, like he had some decent points in there, but at the same time, it sounded like pure hating. I say give the guy a potential chance, but at the same time, I do understand his skepticism. Like he's never been a coach at any level, and he basically said, "I've coached or assisted as in as many NBA games as JJ Redick, and he's going to run the Lakers." And it's like he has a point where I think you need an experienced coach. You need somebody who the locker room respects. Obviously, you need somebody who they like as well, but has a winning resume. I don't think you have the time to kind of just bring in a brand new guy, like a freshman, pretty much. Like I don't think that that's a good look. And since it is JJ Redick, we all know he has the basketball IQ, but does he have the coaching IQ? We're going to have to wait and find out if that's the case. And I think that could potentially be a very rocky road for the Lakers, considering also that they have the podcast together LeBron and Redick. Like, that's not going to be a good look, I think, if it goes bad.
Yeah, and then like also because I think the Athletic were having a piece right where they were asking like Coach K, right,
Hmm.
about stuff like that he where he's kind of acted as sort of like some type of I guess advisor,
Hmm.
kind of giving his thoughts on like hey, here's some guys that might be really good coaches or what
Hmm.
you might want to look for in a head coach, and things like that. But then also like the interesting thing with Reddick, which I hadn't thought about until it was mentioned, in some of those Laker feeds, is the fact that like he's doing something right now where it's like he's covering the NBA playoffs right now. He's going to be covering the finals. So, if he's hired, right, like, that may not be able to happen until after the finals or something, right? Because then obviously if he leaves, that leaves a hole and, they may not be able to replace it. We'll see, obviously, because I don't know what's going to happen.
Hmm.
And then another factor where it's like you don't have that much long before the off season. So then it's like you don't really have a lot of time to kind of come in and kind of like gauge things and figure stuff out, because usually like the coach is there before the draft, before free agency, so that way they can kind of, kind of give their imprint on like, hey, here are guys that kind of fit my type of style and things like that. Not
So
that
basically,
JJ Redick,
hire before June.
yeah, like not that JJ Redick is picking the players and putting the roster together, but even say like last season, I think there was stuff about like Palinka and Ham kind of like, pick the roster together, right? Where like they are the guy, that's how a guy like a Torian Prince, ends up, on the Laker roster, or even like I guess like a Gabe Vincent, or somebody like that. But just in general, like, I guess the main question, for me is like again, like, what is because like in terms of like, does what he think in terms of like basketball and coaching, does that kind of align with like what's probably best for the Lakers? Because we know like this year they tried for a lot of smaller lineups and it didn't work, right? I think it makes a lot more sense, to have some size. So, does he like bigger lineups like say like a Frank Vogel, or does he like smaller lineups like a Ham? But like you said, it's also kind of important where if it's a coach, it's got to be somebody that the locker room respects and likes. Like I think they liked and respected Ham the first year, but it seems like a lot of that disappeared. This season, does that happen with Reddick as well? I think some of that's going to just kind of be determined by the success of the team, right? Where if they make some decent, because this all goes hand in hand. Where it's like if they have a good off season, where they make some good moves and bring in some better fits, and then they have a better season where they don't go out in the first round, there's going to be a lot of good vibes in there, right? But if it's a year like this year or worse, right, then that's probably where, you're going to have the same issues again, where guys are going to be frustrated, guys are going to be upset, and somebody's going to have to pay, right? Probably at a certain point should be Palinka, but, obviously, like, that's not going to happen at this point. So, it's going to be interesting to see who they choose. But, at the same time, if it's not Lou, I mean, it's kind of hard, to really say like it has to be one of the other guys. I think some people would say like, what about Adelman? Because he's, the lead offensive guy for Denver. Look at Denver's offense; that could probably help, the Lakers, in spots. So, again, like, if they hire Reddick, again, it wouldn't be my first pick, but I just don't know enough about a lot of these other guys. Where it's like, even though I've heard the names and I understand it, it's like, I mean, how great are these guys, right? Like say like Micah Nori, was because of Finch's injury, he's kind of like running the show right now for Minnesota. And there were stretches where it was like, I don't know. I mean,
Yeah, there were
y-
stretches where they look like complete horse poop.
yeah, exactly. But at the same time, then they ended up winning. So yeah, I just don't know right at this point. But it feels like as of right now, it seems like he's got the upper hand. And again, like if he's there and you get buy-in from the stars right away, like that goes a long way because the buy-in I don't think was there. For whatever reason this season, even though they kind of tried to rally to win a bunch of games, you could kind of tell like once they were done, they were like, yeah, we don't really care anymore. Like
Yeah.
even like AD, who you don't really think of or hear as about like in terms of being a guy that kind of says a lot of stuff. Right, there was stuff where it was like he was basically done with him after a while, and then we heard right in one of the post game pressers where he's like, we have stretches where we literally don't know what we're doing. And it's like when do you normally hear that in the playoffs at all, right? Like, I mean,
Yeah.
when would you hear, even a team like Denver, like when would you hear them say like, yeah, we have stretches where we literally have no idea what we're doing or what's like you just,
Yeah.
even Minnesota, you don't hear that. And it looks like it at times, but you don't hear that at all. And when But again, it's not just going to be a coaching change that's going to, that would help you improve. You also need to make some changes to the roster as well, right?
Yeah.
Like running, like if you swap JJ Redick with Darvin Ham, does that change the outcome of, the series against the Nuggets? Like probably not. Like, maybe you win one more game, but maybe you lose a game. I
Or
don't
you
know.
were
So,
outclassed. Like at the end of
yeah,
the day, like the roster was just not good enough. Like as
right.
simple as that.
Yeah, so that's how I look at it. But, again, with Reddick, like, if he coaches, we'll see what he does, right? Because again, your starting point is obviously a lot different, right, than coaching Charlotte or Toronto, because you're not coaching a rebuilding team. You're coaching a team with some, big time stars,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like this could be the last coach that LeBron plays for, because we know that he's not going to be playing for 10 more seasons at this point. So, we'll see what happens.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Well, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, shout out to the people who showed out in the live stream. Also, shout out to the people who, made that last short that we put out, the most viewed video on this channel ever, right? We also gained 3 new subscribers, so we appreciate that. We hope to maybe see you guys or viewers in the live streams or, in the comments. Again, continue to like, comment, and subscribe. If you comment, we haven't said this in a while, but we will read it at the beginning of the video. Haven't read any in a while because we haven't had any comments, but we'd appreciate it if you did. And then obviously, again, we're gonna have a live stream, after the game ones as well, right? So that's Tuesday and Wednesday. So, regardless of the outcome, we're gonna be live streaming at the beginning and the end of those series. So we hope to either, see you the next episode or see you in the next live stream.